I need to tell you about a town in the Pacific Northwest that lived with a countdown to terror for 40 years. Starting in 1982, the residents of a small logging community heard the same sound every single night at 10:03 p.m. Not approximately 10:03, not around that time, exactly 10:03 p.m., with the precision of an atomic clock. It was a scream, inhuman, guttural, filled with what witnesses could only describe as rage or agony, sometimes both at once. The kind of sound that made your body understand danger before your mind caught up. For 4 decades, this continued without fail. Every investigation found nothing. Every search came up empty. The sound became part of the town's rhythm, a terrible certainty marking the passage of each day. Then one night, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. What replaced the screams made residents realize they'd misunderstood everything. The 40 years of nightly terror hadn't been random. They'd been a warning, a territorial declaration from something that had now decided warnings were no longer necessary. This is what happened in those 40 years, and what the silence revealed. The town didn't have a name I can give you. What I can tell you is that it sat in a river valley in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by old-growth forests that stretched for miles in every direction. Population around 1,200. 2 churches, 1 grocery store, a volunteer fire department. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where life followed the rhythms of logging seasons and school calendars, and the slow turn of years. It was April 1982 when the screaming started. The first night, people called it in to the sheriff's office, starting at 10:04 p.m. Dispatch received 47 calls in the span of 6 minutes, all reporting the same thing, an enormous, inhuman scream that had torn through the darkness at 10:03 p.m., lasting approximately 8 to 12 seconds, coming from the direction of the ridgeline to the east. I've listened to the recordings of those calls. The panic in the voices was real. Several callers were crying. One woman kept repeating that it sounded like something was being killed. A logger with 30 years in the woods told the dispatcher he'd never heard anything like it, not from any animal he knew. The sheriff organized a search party that went out at first light. They found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no blood, no disturbed vegetation. Nothing that would explain a sound that had been heard clearly by over 300 people across a 2-mile radius. The second night, it happened again, 10:03 p.m. exactly. The same duration, the same direction, the same bone-deep wrongness to the sound. By the end of the first week, people stopped calling it in. The sheriff's department had no answers. The sound came, like clockwork, and then it was gone until the next night. What did it sound like? The comparisons varied, but certain descriptions came up again and again. A bear in agony, a woman screaming through a distorted speaker, the sound of something massive forcing air through vocal anatomy that shouldn't exist. The most useful comparison came from a wildlife biologist who drove up from the university in May 1982 to investigate. He brought recording equipment and captured the sound on tape. When he played it back for colleagues, their assessment was documented in a report I've seen. The vocalization demonstrated lung capacity consistent with a large mammal, possibly in the range of an adult grizzly bear. But the modulation and tonal complexity suggested primate vocal anatomy. The sound contained what they described as intentional variation that didn't match known animal distress calls or territorial vocalizations. One phrase appeared in multiple witness statements from those early weeks. It sounded intelligent. Not intelligent like a dolphin or a crow. Intelligent like something that understood exactly what it was doing and exactly what effect it was having on the humans who heard it. The Sierra Sounds recordings, made by Ron Moorhead and Al Berry in the 1970s in California's Sierra Nevada mountains, are the closest documented comparison. Those recordings captured vocalizations that cryptozoology researchers still debate, complex chattering and howling that doesn't match any known North American wildlife. The sounds have a conversational quality, a back-and-forth pattern that suggests communication rather than random animal noise. The screams from the ridge had that same quality of wrongness. They sounded like language you couldn't understand, expelled with force that suggested rage. By summer 1982, the town had developed its first coping mechanism, denial that it was anything unusual. People started saying it was probably just a mountain lion with a territory nearby. Never mind that mountain lions don't vocalize on a fixed schedule. Never mind that experienced hunters in the area said it sounded nothing like a cougar. The scream came at 10:03 p.m. every single night, and the town learned to live with it. Parents started putting children to bed earlier. The local bar, which had stayed open until midnight on weekends, started closing at 9. Nobody said it was because of the scream. Nobody had to. The high school kids were the only ones who treated it differently. By fall, that 1982, being out in the woods near scream time had become a test of courage. Groups would hike up toward the ridge, timing it so they'd be a quarter mile into the forest when 10:03 arrived. Most of them ran back before the sound finished. Some claimed they felt it in their chests, a physical vibration that moved through the trees. One detail emerged in those first months that would become important later. The scream always came from the same direction, but the exact location was impossible to pinpoint. Sound moves strangely in mountain terrain, bouncing off ridges and filling valleys. But experienced hunters noted something else. The acoustics didn't behave right. The scream seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the source was moving, or as if there were multiple sources coordinating their timing to the second. 3 different audio experts came to town in 1983, brought in by television crews or researchers. All 3 set up triangulation equipment, trying to locate the source. All 3 failed. The scream's point of origin couldn't be determined with any precision beyond somewhere in the eastern forest zone, between 1 and 4 miles out. By the end of the first year, the nightly scream had become part of the town's identity. Visitors noticed it immediately. Residents had stopped noticing it at all, in the way you stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator or the sound of traffic. It was just there, a fact of life, like the rain. But that first year established something else, the precision. 10:03 p.m. every night, without variation. Not 10:02, not 10:04. People started checking their watches against it. The scream was more accurate than the church bell, more reliable than the radio time signals. Whatever was making that sound, it was keeping time. The official investigations lasted from April 1982 through March 1985. Though calling them official overstates their coordination. What actually happened was a series of disconnected attempts by different agencies and individuals, none of whom shared information effectively, all of whom reached the same conclusion: nothing. The county sheriff's department handled the first response. I've read their incident reports. In the first 2 weeks, they sent officers into the forest 16 separate times, including 3 overnight operations where deputies positioned themselves in the woods before 10:03 p.m., hoping to observe the source of the sound. The reports described the experience the same way. The scream would come, impossibly loud, seeming to originate from everywhere at once. Officers would move toward what they believed was the source. They would find nothing. No tracks in the soil, no broken branches, no scat, no hair, no sign that anything larger than a squirrel had passed through the area. One deputy wrote in his report, "Sound appeared to come from approximately 400 yards northeast of position. Arrived at estimated location within 3 minutes." No evidence of animal presence. No tracks despite soft ground from recent rain. Beginning to question whether sound originates from ground level at all. That last observation became a recurring theory. Maybe the sound was coming from above. Maybe it was some kind of bird, something in the canopy. But no bird species in North America produces vocalizations at that volume or with that acoustic signature. And no bird maintains a schedule accurate to the minute. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife sent a team in June 1982. 3 wildlife biologists spent 2 weeks in the area, setting up camera traps and audio, recording equipment at various points in the forest. They captured the scream on tape every night. Their cameras captured nothing. Not a single frame showed anything larger than a raccoon. Their official report, filed in July 1982, concluded that the sound was of unknown origin, likely produced by a combination of atmospheric conditions and local geography creating unusual acoustic effects. It was the kind of non-answer that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while acknowledging they had no idea what they were dealing with. The first serious academic attention came in September 1982 when Dr. Lawrence Chen, an acoustic specialist from Oregon State University, arrived with graduate students and professional recording equipment. Chen had published papers on bioacoustics and animal communication. He approached the phenomenon as a scientific puzzle. Chen's team spent 6 weeks in the area. They set up a triangulation array using synchronized recording equipment positioned at 5 different points around the valley. The goal was to capture the scream from multiple angles simultaneously and use the slight time delays between recordings to pinpoint the exact source location. The experiment failed, but the failure was instructive. Chen's analysis, which I've seen excerpts from, noted that the time delays between recording positions didn't make sense. The sound appeared to arrive at all 5 locations simultaneously, which was physically impossible unless the source was either much farther away than the volume suggested, or the sound was somehow being produced from multiple points at once. Chen's conclusion, never officially published, but shared with colleagues. The acoustic properties of the recorded vocalizations are inconsistent with the single point source origin. Either the source is moving at impossible speeds during the vocalization event, or we are dealing with a phenomenon that does not conform to standard models of sound propagation. He left in October 1982 and never returned. The television cruise came next. Between 1983 and 1984, 3 separate paranormal investigation shows filmed episodes in the area. They brought thermal imaging equipment, night vision cameras, and teams of investigators who set up elaborate monitoring systems. All 3 shows aired episodes featuring dramatic footage of their hosts reacting to the scream, describing its terrifying qualities, and speculating about its origin. None of them captured any visual evidence. The thermal cameras showed nothing. The night vision revealed empty forest. One of those shows, I won't name it, staged footage of a dark figure moving through the trees. Residents who appeared as witnesses later said they'd been told what to say. The figure was a production assistant in a dark jacket. After that, the town became less cooperative with media requests. The private investigators were more serious. Between 1984 and 1985, at least 4 different individuals or small teams came to the area on their own initiative. Most were cryptozoology enthusiasts, convinced they were dealing with a Sasquatch or similar creature. They would spend a week or 2 camping in the forest, hiking during the day, looking for evidence. Track casts were made of various prints. All were later identified as known animals: elk, black bear, cougar. Some investigators claimed to find tree structures or markers that suggested intelligent arrangement of branches. Local forest rangers pointed out that falling trees and wind create random patterns that can look deliberate if you're looking for deliberation. One investigator, a retired forest ranger named William Haskell, took a different approach. Instead of searching for the creature, he studied the town. He interviewed residents, compiled decades of local folklore, and researched the history of the area going back to indigenous accounts. Haskell's notes, which he shared with a small circle of researchers, included something interesting. The local indigenous people, whose traditional territory included this valley, had stories about the area. Not specific stories about screams, but stories about certain places in the forest where people didn't go, where the boundary between the human world and something else became thin. The ridge where the screams seemed to originate was part of one of those traditional avoidance zones. Haskell died in 1991. His research was never formally published. By 1985, the investigations had stopped. Not because the phenomenon had ended, but because every investigative avenue had been exhausted. Whatever was producing the scream left no physical evidence, couldn't be captured on camera, and couldn't be located despite sophisticated acoustic equipment. The failure of the investigations established something important. This wasn't a simple case of mistaken identity or a known animal behaving unusually. Every expert who examined the phenomenon came away baffled. The sound was real, recorded dozens of times on professional equipment, but its source remained completely undetectable. The town was left with a choice: keep searching for answers that clearly weren't coming, or adapt to living with a mystery that had become routine. They chose adaptation. The investigations ended. The scream continued. And the real story, the story of what it meant to live with this thing for 40 years, was just beginning. The first few months after the screaming began, Echo Lake residents lived in a state of suspended crisis. Every night brought the same impossible question: would tonight be the night something finally emerged from the trees? Would the screaming stop being just sound and become action? But months became years. Years became decades. And the 10:03 p.m. scream never changed, never moved closer, never grew more aggressive, never evolved into anything beyond that single, bone-chilling vocalization that tore through the darkness with mechanical precision. So, the town did what humans do when confronted with the inexplicable. They adapted. By 1985, 3 years into the phenomenon, Echo Lake had developed an entire culture around the nightly scream. An unspoken curfew settled over the community. At 9:45 p.m., you'd see porch lights clicking on up and down residential streets. Dogs were called inside. Cats were locked in for the night. Children playing in the yards during summer evenings knew without being told that when the streetlights came on, it was time to head home. Not because of traffic or strangers, but because of what waited in the forest. The 20 minutes before 10:03 became a kind of town-wide ritual. Televisions would be turned up slightly. Conversations would pause. Parents would glance at clocks. And then it would come, that familiar, terrible sound, washing over the valley like a wave of audible dread. I spoke with Michael Torres, who was 7 years old when the screaming started and grew up to become Echo Lake's fire chief. He described what it was like being raised in a town where primal terror arrived on schedule every single night. You know how some kids grow up with tornado sirens or earthquake drills? We grew up with the scream, he told me. It was just part of life. My little sister was born in 1984, so she never knew a world without it. For her, it was completely normal, like the sun rising or the mail coming. That's what gets me. We raised an entire generation of kids who thought it was normal to have something inhuman screaming at them from the woods every night. The psychological impact of this kind of chronic, predictable terror differs fundamentally from a single frightening event. A one-time encounter produces acute fear, followed by gradual recovery. But 40 years of nightly reminders that something unknown occupies the forest creates a baseline state. Not panic, but a persistent low-grade awareness that you share this valley with something you don't understand and can't control. Dr. Sarah Chen, a clinical psychologist who wrote her doctoral thesis on collective trauma in isolated communities, pointed to Echo Lake as a case study in normalized fear. What's remarkable is how the human psyche recalibrates, she explained. After about 6 months of consistent exposure to a frightening stimulus that doesn't escalate, the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, essentially says, "Okay, this is our new normal." People continue experiencing fear, but it becomes background noise. They function, they live, but there's a psychological toll that accumulates over time. Higher rates of anxiety disorders, sleep disruption, hypervigilance. The body never fully relaxes because part of the brain is always tracking the threat, even when it becomes routine. Teenagers in Echo Lake developed their own relationship with the phenomenon. While their parents maintained a respectful distance from the forest's edge, high school students turned proximity to the woods during scream time into tests of courage. Groups would gather at the old logging road that marked the eastern boundary of town, daring each other to stand closer to the tree line when 10:03 arrived. Jennifer Kozlowski, who graduated from Echo Lake High in 1994, remembered these gatherings with a mixture of nostalgia and embarrassment. It seems stupid now, but when you're 16 and you've been hearing that scream your entire conscious life, you start getting almost cocky about it, like we wanted to prove we weren't afraid. Or maybe we were trying to take some power back from whatever was out there. So yeah, we'd go stand by the woods at 10 o'clock, drinking stolen beer, acting tough. And then it would scream, and every single one of us would jump. Every single time. We never got used to it. Not really. The scream itself never became less terrifying with familiarity. That's a crucial detail. Usually repeated exposure to a stimulus diminishes its emotional impact. But the Echo Lake scream maintained its psychological power across 4 decades. Parents who had heard it for 30 years still felt their heartbeats spike when 10:03 approached. Children born in the 2000s experienced the same primal fear as residents who remembered the first scream in 1982. This consistency of terror across generations speaks to something in the sound itself, something that triggered deep, evolutionary responses. Whatever vocal structures produced that sound, they tap directly into the part of the human brain that recognizes apex predators, that knows the difference between a threat display and mere noise. The town developed small rituals of comfort around the phenomenon. Some families would hold hands during the scream. Others would turn music up loud enough to partially mask it. One woman told me she baked bread every evening, timing it so the scent of fresh-baked loaves filled her kitchen right at 10:03, creating a sensory association between home comfort and the nightly terror. A small act of psychological self-defense. But perhaps the strangest adaptation was how the scream became a kind of communal timepiece. Watches were checked against it. If you heard the scream while driving home from a neighboring town, you knew exactly what time it was without looking at a clock. Parents would call out to children playing in other rooms, "Scream in 5 minutes. Finish up what you're doing." It was the world's most disturbing cuckoo clock, and it ran with perfect accuracy for 40 years. The phenomenon created an unspoken bond among residents. When you mentioned you were from Echo Lake to someone outside the valley, the response was always the same. A pause, a look of recognition, and then the question, "Is it true about the screaming?" And you'd confirm that yes, it was true, and yes, you heard it every single night, and no, nobody knew what it was. This shared experience created a kind of survivor's solidarity. Residents looked at each other with the understanding that they were all living through something most people would consider unbearable, and they were managing it, night after night, year after year. There was pride in that resilience, even as the fear persisted. But underneath the adaptation, beneath the routines and rituals and teenage bravado, a deeper truth settled into the collective consciousness of Echo Lake. The forest surrounding their town was occupied. Something claimed those woods as territory. And every night at 10:03 p.m., it reminded the human inhabitants that they lived there only by tolerance, that the mountains had an owner, and that owner was patient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to human presence. It was, as one longtime resident put it, a form of psychological warfare. The creature, whatever it was, wasn't just living near them. It was making a statement every single night. This is my land. You are visitors, and I am always here. For 40 years the message was received. The question no one could answer was what the creature wanted them to do with that information. For most Echo Lake residents, there was only one name for the thing in the woods: Bigfoot. This wasn't a myth discussed in hushed tones around campfires. This was their neighbor, a very large, very loud, and very reclusive neighbor that maintained strict boundaries and made its territorial claims known with regularity that bordered on obsessive. The Sasquatch theory emerged naturally in those early years, gaining traction as the most logical explanation for a phenomenon that defied easy categorization. The Pacific Northwest has a documented history of Bigfoot sightings stretching back centuries. Native American tribes in the region spoke of stick Indians and mountain devils long before white settlers arrived. The forests of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California provide ideal habitat for a large, reclusive primate. Vast wilderness, limited human presence, abundant food sources, and terrain so rugged that entire valleys can go unexplored for decades. But beyond regional folklore, there was actual scientific framework to support the possibility of an unknown great ape inhabiting North American forests. Dr. Jeff Meldrum, professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, has spent decades studying the biomechanics of bipedal locomotion in primates. His research examines the anatomical requirements for an upright walking ape and whether such a creature could exist undetected in wilderness environments. While Meldrum stops short of claiming definitive proof of Sasquatch's existence, his work demonstrates that the basic biological framework is plausible. A large bipedal primate with estimated weight between 600 and 800 pounds would require specific skeletal adaptations, particularly in the foot structure and hip joint, that differ from both human and known great ape anatomy. Footprint casts collected from various sites show precisely these adaptations. A mid-tarsal break absent in humans, but present in other apes, and dermal ridges consistent with primate physiology. The vocal capacity of such a creature became a particular focus for Echo Lake residents trying to understand their nightly visitor. The scream's volume and tonal range suggested lung capacity far exceeding human capability, more comparable to a grizzly bear or large silverback gorilla. Yet the modulation, the way the sound shifted and evolved over its 10 to 12-second duration, indicated vocal control beyond simple roaring. It had structure, pattern, what researchers call phonemic complexity. This combination, raw power with sophisticated modulation, aligned with what primatologists observe in other great apes. Gibbons, for example, perform elaborate vocal displays every morning at dawn, marking territory through songs that can carry for several miles through dense jungle. These aren't random screams, but ritualized vocalizations following specific patterns, maintained across generations. Male howler monkeys engage in similar behavior, producing calls so loud they can be heard 3 miles away, announcing their presence to rivals and establishing dominance without physical confrontation. The 10:03 p.m. timing of the echo lake scream fit perfectly into this behavioral pattern. If the creature was indeed a Sasquatch, the nightly vocalization would serve as a territorial declaration, a way of saying, "This mountain range is claimed," without the energy expenditure or risk of actual physical confrontation with intruders. The precise timing suggested habitual behavior, something ingrained so deeply it became as automatic as any other circadian rhythm. Several Echo Lake residents reported sightings over the years that seemed to confirm the Bigfoot hypotheses. Thomas Whitfield, a retired logger who lived on the eastern edge of town where forest met residential development, described an encounter from 1989 that he said confirmed what he'd suspected since the screaming began. "It was dusk, maybe 20 minutes before the scream was due," Whitfield recounted. "I was standing on my back deck having a cigarette, and I saw something move along the ridgeline, maybe 400 yards out, where the pines get thick. At first I thought it was a bear because of the size, but then it stood up, all the way up, and it was shaped wrong for a bear. Shoulders too broad, head too small in proportion to the body. It stood there for maybe 10 seconds, looking down toward the town. Then it turned and walked into the trees. Not on all fours, upright like a man would walk, but it must have been 8 feet tall, easy." Whitfield wasn't alone. Over 40 years, at least 24 residents reported similar sightings, always at distance, always at dusk or dawn, always the same description: massive, hair-covered, bipedal, moving with purpose and awareness, never approaching, never threatening, but watching. Always watching. The physical evidence, while scarce, pointed in the same direction. Footprints were occasionally discovered, massive impressions measuring 17 to 19 inches in length, showing a stride length that exceeded human capability. Hair samples collected from barbed wire fences along the forest boundary came back as unknown primate when analyzed, matching neither bear, elk, nor any cataloged North American mammal. And then there were the tree structures. Throughout the forests surrounding Echo Lake, hikers occasionally stumbled across arrangements of branches and logs that seemed deliberately constructed. Large trees, some measuring 8 to 10 inches in diameter, would be found snapped at chest height and woven through standing timber to form X patterns or arches. The force required to break wood of that thickness exceeds human capability without tools, yet the breaks showed no saw marks or axe cuts, just raw, splintered wood where something had snapped them like kindling. Bigfoot. Researchers call these markers, or signposts. Territorial indicators similar to how bears leave claw marks on trees or deer create scrapes on the ground. Whether the Echo Lake structures served this purpose remains speculation, but their presence in the same forest producing nightly screams felt like more than coincidence to residents who discovered them. The behavioral pattern fit established primate social structures as well. The occasional secondary screams, the answers that sometimes followed the primary vocalization, suggested multiple individuals, possibly a family group. This aligned with what researchers theorize about Sasquatch social organization. Small family units maintaining large territories, using vocalizations to communicate across distances, avoiding human contact through learned behavior passed from generation to generation. Dr. Meldrum's work on primate intelligence provides context for how such a creature could remain undetected despite producing nightly vocalizations from the same general area. Great apes demonstrate sophisticated understanding of human behavior, learning to avoid trails, cameras, and search patterns. Gorillas in Africa have been observed changing their travel routes when researchers attempt to habituate them. suggesting they understand they're being tracked and actively choose to remain hidden. If Sasquatch exists and possesses similar or greater intelligence, remaining undetected while still maintaining territorial claims through vocal displays would represent exactly the kind of behavior you'd expect. Maximum impact with minimum exposure. The counter-argument, of course, was the same one that plagued all Bigfoot research. Where were the bodies? Where was the definitive proof? How could a breeding population of large primates exist for centuries without a single corpse, a single skeleton, a single piece of evidence that met scientific standards? The question hung over Echo Lake like the scream itself, impossible to answer, impossible to ignore. But for the residents who heard that sound every night, who felt its power in their chest cavities, who saw the darkness of the forest and understood something occupied that darkness, with intelligence and intention, the lack of a body didn't make the creature any less real. They knew what they heard. They knew it wasn't wind, wasn't machinery, wasn't any cataloged animal in any wildlife database. It was a voice from the deep wilderness, announcing its presence with the kind of confidence that comes from being apex, from being unchallenged, from owning territory so completely that even the trees seemed to acknowledge its dominance. And every night at 10:03 p.m., that voice reminded the humans of Echo Lake that the forest had an owner, and they were living in it. Scientists hate mysteries. They hate them because mysteries suggest gaps in understanding, and gaps in understanding mean the models don't work. So when the Echo Lake phenomenon reached the attention of researchers outside the Pacific Northwest, they did what scientists do. They proposed rational explanations. The first theory was the simplest. Mountain lions. The cats are known for screams that sound almost human, particularly during mating season. Wildlife biologists pointed out that cougars inhabited the forests around Echo Lake and that their vocalizations could carry for miles under the right atmospheric conditions. The problem was timing. Mountain lions don't scream on a schedule. They don't vocalize at precisely 10:03 p.m. every single night for 40 years. Mating seasons come and go. Individual animals are born. They hunt. They die. No single cougar lives 4 decades, and no population maintains that kind of behavioral consistency across generations. The same logic demolished the fox hypothesis, the bobcat theory, and even the suggestion of elk or deer in distress. Animals don't keep appointments. Then came the geophysical explanations. A team from the University of Washington proposed that underground gas vents could create pressure releases at regular intervals, producing sound as the gas escaped through specific rock formations. They cited examples of singing caves, where wind through limestone passages creates sustained tones, and geothermal areas where steam vents produce mechanical screams as pressure equalizes. They drove out to Echo Lake with seismic equipment and gas sensors. They spent 2 weeks mapping the geology beneath the town and the surrounding forest. They found nothing. No vents. No unusual geothermal activity. No cave systems with the acoustic properties that would explain a sound audible across an entire valley. One researcher suggested it might be an Aeolian harp effect, wind moving through a precise configuration of trees or rock formations at a specific velocity, creating a sustained tone like air blown across a bottle's mouth. But wind isn't punctual. Wind doesn't arrive at 10:03 p.m. and then stop. And wind doesn't sound like it has lungs. The acoustic analysis only deepened the problem. When sound engineers examined recordings made by residents, they identified characteristics that didn't match any known natural phenomenon. The scream had structure. It began with a low rumble, built to a sustained howl with harmonic variations, and ended with what sounded like deliberate modulation, pitch changes that suggested vocal control, not random noise. One engineer noted something that disturbed him enough that he included it in his official report. The scream showed evidence of intentional rhythm, as if whatever produced it was aware of how sound carries, and was optimizing the vocalization for maximum range and psychological impact. That observation moved the discussion into uncomfortable territory. Intentionality meant intelligence. Intelligence meant consciousness. And consciousness in something unknown meant the comfortable categories of natural phenomenon or misidentified wildlife no longer applied. A smaller group of researchers proposed something stranger. Dr. Helena Voss, a parapsychologist from Portland State University, suggested the screams might not have a physical source at all. She referenced cases of environmental hauntings, locations where traumatic events seemed to imprint themselves on the landscape, replaying like recordings triggered by unknown conditions. She theorized that Echo Lake might be experiencing a genius loci phenomenon, a kind of psychic scar created by some long-forgotten trauma in the area's history. Perhaps a massacre, a natural disaster, or some event so emotionally charged that it left a residue that manifested as sound. The regularity, she argued, suggested a trigger mechanism tied to time rather than conscious agency. The town had no recorded history of major tragedies, no massacres, no mass deaths, no documented events that would explain that level of psychic trauma. Voss suggested the event might predate written records entirely, something from the region's deep past that left no witnesses capable of documenting it. Most residents found the paranormal explanation less comforting than the idea of an animal. A mountain lion could be tracked, possibly relocated. A geophysical phenomenon could be understood and perhaps mitigated. But a haunting, a wound in reality itself, offered no solution. You couldn't negotiate with a psychic scar. You couldn't wait for it to move on or die of old age. And there was another problem with the paranormal theory. Hauntings are static. They replay the same moment exactly as it occurred. But residents had begun noticing subtle variations in the screams. Some nights it sounded closer. Some nights there seemed to be an answering call from deeper in the forest, too faint for recording equipment, but audible to those who'd trained themselves to listen. That suggested something dynamic, something responsive, something alive. Tom Hendricks moved to Echo Lake in 1985, 3 years after the screaming started. He was a graduate student then, studying wildlife biology, drawn by reports of an unidentified vocalization that had stumped every expert who'd examined it. He planned to stay for a single season, gather recordings, complete his thesis, and leave. He never left. 40 years later, he had the most comprehensive archive of the phenomenon anyone had assembled. Thousands of hours of audio, meteorological data, lunar cycles, seasonal variations, and correlations with every variable he could measure. I spoke with Hendricks in 2023, the year after the screaming stopped. His house sat at the eastern edge of town, backing directly onto forest. His office was a converted garage filled with recording equipment, spectrographic analysis software, and filing cabinets, containing decades of handwritten logs. Everyone heard the scream, he told me, but most people only heard it. I listened. What he heard were patterns within, the primary pattern. Variations so subtle that casual listeners missed them entirely, but consistent enough that they pointed towards something beyond simple animal behavior or random geological events. The first pattern involved seasonal intensity. The screams were loudest during late fall and winter, October through February. During summer months, particularly June and July, the volume decreased noticeably, though the timing remained exact. Hendricks measured decibel levels from fixed recording positions over 15 years and found the variation followed a predictable annual curve. That suggested territory, he explained. Many animals vocalize more aggressively during specific seasons: mating, migration, resource scarcity. But the timing was wrong. Peak intensity came during winter, when most animals are conserving energy, not advertising their presence. The second pattern was more disturbing. On approximately 20% of nights, the primary scream at 10:03 p.m. was followed by a secondary vocalization 7 to 12 seconds later, coming from a different location deeper in the forest. The secondary scream was quieter, slightly higher in pitch, and never lasted as long as the primary. The two sounds never overlapped. The secondary always waited until the primary finished. Hendricks documented this interaction across 18 years before the pattern became undeniable. This was call and response. Communication. Two entities, he said, at minimum. Possibly more, though I only ever recorded 2 distinct vocalizations per night. The third pattern emerged from cross-referencing the audio logs with incident reports. Every few months, during the periods when the screams reached their highest intensity, livestock would go missing from properties within 3 miles of town. Never cattle, too large and difficult to move. Mostly chickens, occasionally goats. The animals vanished without evidence of predation at the site. No blood, no feathers scattered. By struggle, no damage to enclosures beyond open gates or displaced fence sections. Park rangers found partial remains several times, bones picked clean, scattered in dense forest 2 or 3 miles from the nearest road. The scattering pattern suggested intelligence. The bones weren't left in kill sites the way a bear or cougar would leave them. They were distributed, almost deliberately hidden, as if something understood that concentrated evidence would draw attention. No dogs ever went missing. That fact bothered Hendricks more than the livestock disappearances. Predators don't distinguish between chickens and small dogs based on property value. But something did. Something that understood the difference between food animals and pets, or that recognized dogs as potential threats worth avoiding. It knew we lived here, Hendricks said. It knew the boundaries. It took what it could take without triggering a response that might threaten it. The most unsettling pattern involved the recordings themselves. Hendricks played me segments from different years, isolated on spectrographic software that turned sound into visual waveforms. The fundamental structure remained consistent, the same basic acoustic signature year after year. But embedded in that consistency were micro-variations, slight changes in pitch modulation and rhythm that appeared gradually over time. "Listen to 1987, he said, playing a clip. The scream sounded exactly as residents described: powerful, inhuman, filled with what could only be called rage. Now listen to 2015. He played another segment. The difference was subtle, but unmistakable. The later recording had refinement. The pitch changes were more controlled, the rhythm more deliberate. It sounded less like raw vocalization and more like speech, not words, nothing that resembled language. But the acoustic structure had evolved toward communication rather than simple noise. Whatever made this sound was learning, Hendricks said, refining the vocalization over decades. That rules out geology, eliminates atmospheric phenomena, and makes the paranormal explanation unlikely. Hauntings don't evolve. Animals don't refine territorial calls across 40 years unless they're adapting them for a specific purpose. He showed me his mapping data. He'd used triangulation from multiple recording positions to estimate the source location of both primary and secondary screams. The primary came from a ridge system approximately 4 miles northeast of town, an area of old-growth forest and steep ravines that made access difficult. The secondary originated from varied locations, but always deeper in the wilderness, always farther from human habitation. The primary scream marked a boundary, he said, a line it was telling us not to cross. The secondary was confirmation from another individual, or maybe a response from the same entity after it moved position. Either way, this was communication with purpose, territorial marking with the explicit goal of keeping us contained. I asked him the obvious question. If the goal was to keep humans away, why scream toward town rather than into the forest? Why make yourself known at all? Hendricks had thought about that for 40 years. Because isolation only works if both parties maintain the boundary, he said. It needed us to know it was there, needed us to understand the forest wasn't ours. The scream wasn't a threat. It was a treaty we never agreed to, and for 40 years, we honored it anyway. The night the screaming stopped was unremarkable in every way but one. It was a Tuesday in late October 2022. The scream came at 10:03 p.m., exactly as it had for 40 years. Residents in their homes heard it through closed windows. A couple walking their dog on Maple Street stopped mid-conversation as the sound rolled down from the mountains. 3 teenagers sitting in a parked car at the edge of town felt it in their chests. It sounded like every other scream. The same duration, the same impossible volume, the same quality that made your brainstem light up with warnings your higher mind couldn't override. Then it ended. And that was the last one. The following night, the town held its breath. People found reasons to be near windows at 10 p.m. Conversations trailed off as clocks ticked toward 10:03. Some residents stood on their porches, watching the dark tree line. 10:03 came and went in total silence. Nothing. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 2. 5. By 10:15, people were checking their phones, confirming the time, wondering if their watches had somehow all stopped simultaneously during the preceding years, and they'd simply never noticed. The silence continued the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the first week, the local diner was filled with speculation. By the end of the second week, the unease had settled into something heavier. The relief everyone expected never materialized. I need to tell you what that silence felt like. For 40 years, the scream had been a constant. Terrifying, yes, but predictable. It structured their nights. It gave them something to brace for, to prepare for, to mark time by. Parents knew to have their children inside before 10 p.m. Dog owners developed routines around it. The scream was horrible, but it was known. The silence was neither. Some residents proposed the obvious explanation. It had died. Whatever produced those sounds had finally reached the end of its lifespan. Natural causes, old age, an injury in the deep wilderness that proved fatal. This explanation satisfied almost no one. Others suggested it had moved on, perhaps increasing human activity in the region, new hiking trails, expanded cell coverage, a minor boom in remote work bringing new residents to the area, had finally pushed it out. The territory it had claimed with such ferocity for 4 decades had become untenable. But this raised a question that kept people awake. What could force out something that had held this ground for 40 years? What arrives in the mountains that makes a creature of that size and power concede territory? The third theory was the one nobody wanted to voice in full daylight, though it circulated in late-night conversations and unfinished sentences. The screams had served a purpose, a territorial declaration, a boundary marker broadcast nightly to ensure compliance. For 40 years it had worked. The town stayed in the town. The deep woods remained undisturbed. If the screaming had stopped, perhaps the purpose had simply changed. Perhaps the territory was no longer being contested. Perhaps the boundary had been accepted, internalized, made permanent. Perhaps whatever had been shouting from the mountainside no longer needed to announce itself because the message had been received and would not be challenged. The silence, in this framework, was not absence. It was dominance made manifest. Martha Kowalski, now 73, had heard the first scream in 1982 when she was 33 years old. She'd raised 2 children in Echo Lake, both of whom had grown up with a 10:03 p.m. ritual so embedded in their lives they didn't question it until college, when they realized other towns didn't have nightly countdowns to auditory terror. 3 weeks after the screaming stopped, she gave an interview to a regional news outlet that had picked up the story. "I thought I'd feel safer," she said. "I thought I'd sleep better. But I don't. When it was screaming, I knew where it was. Out there, in the mountains, distance between us. Now I don't know where it is. I don't know if it's still out there at all or if it's closer." She paused, then added, "The scream kept it far away. That's what I think now. It was shouting from a distance. Now it's not shouting." The silence deepened through November and into December. The town's anxiety didn't diminish with time. It metastasized. The absence of the scream left space for other sounds, other sensations, other observations that had always been there, but drowned beneath the overwhelming nightly roar. And people began noticing things. The whispers started in the 3rd week of silence. Janet Herschel reported it first. She'd lived on the eastern edge of town for 16 years, her property backing directly onto Forest Service land. On a Thursday night in mid-November, she'd gone outside at 11:30 p.m. to bring in a chair she'd left on the deck. She heard a voice at the tree line, faint but distinct. It sounded like someone speaking just below conversational volume. She couldn't make out words, but the rhythm was human, the cadence of speech. She called out, asking if someone needed help. The whispering stopped immediately. She went inside, locked the door, and didn't mention it to anyone for 3 days. When she finally told her neighbor, the neighbor went quiet, then admitted she'd heard something similar too, nights prior. A low murmuring from the woods behind her garage. She'd assumed it was teenagers. By December, 7 residents had reported hearing whispers, voices, or what sounded like distant conversation coming from the forest after dark. None of them could make out words. None of them found any source when they investigated in daylight. The whispers were always just at the edge of comprehension, always from the woods, always after 10 p.m. Then came the sightings. Tom Bradshaw had been walking his property line at dusk in early December, checking fence posts before the first snow. His land stretched back into a stand of old-growth Douglas fir. At the far corner of his property, maybe 60 yards from his house, he looked up and saw something standing among the trees. It was large, easily 7 feet tall, he estimated, though distance made certainty impossible. Dark, covered in what looked like dark hair or fur. It was standing upright on 2 legs, motionless, facing his direction. He stared at it. It didn't move. He took 3 steps toward it. Still nothing. No reaction. No retreat. He stopped, suddenly aware of how far he was from his house, how close to full darkness it had become. When he looked back at the trees, the figure was gone. He reported it to local authorities, who conducted a search the following day. They found nothing. No tracks in the soft ground. No disturbed vegetation. No physical evidence of anything having stood in that location. But Tom knew what he'd seen, and what unsettled him most wasn't the size or the appearance of the figure. It was the stillness, the quiet observation. It had been watching his house. 3 other residents reported similar sightings over the next 2 weeks. A large, dark, bipedal figure standing motionless among trees at dusk, always watching, never approaching, never fleeing when noticed. It was simply there, observing. The physical signs appeared in January. hikers began finding structures in the woods. Stick formations arranged in deliberate X patterns, some of them 8 feet tall, constructed from branches too heavy for a person to lift easily. Arches made of bent saplings, configurations that had no obvious natural explanation. Lisa Ortega, a biology teacher who'd hiked the local trails for 15 years, photographed several of these structures. She'd never seen anything like them before the silence. Now they were appearing on trails she walked weekly. "These aren't random," she said, showing the photographs to anyone who would look. "Look at the symmetry. Look at how the branches are woven together. This took time. This took intention." Rocks began appearing in places they shouldn't be, stacked in deliberate cairns, arranged in lines, placed on stumps or fence posts in patterns that suggested intelligence, communication, or marking. And then there were the prints. In late January, after a light rain left the ground soft, a resident found an impression in the mud near the walking trail that ran behind the elementary school. The print was 17 inches long. It showed 5 distinct toe impressions. The depth suggested significant weight. A cast was made. Photographs were taken. The print was sent to Dr. Jeff Meldrum at Idaho State University, who confirmed it matched the morphology of suspected Sasquatch tracks he'd documented elsewhere. A flexible mid-tarsal break, dermal ridges, toe positioning consistent with a bipedal primate adapted for rough terrain. The print was less than 100 yards from the school playground. What made residents' blood run cold wasn't the existence of the print. It was the location. For 40 years, the screaming had come from deep in the mountains, miles from town. Now evidence was appearing at the edges of residential areas, near homes, near schools. The distance that had defined the relationship for 4 decades was collapsing. Sarah Chen, who'd moved to Echo Lake in 1985 and raised 3 children, there tried to articulate what many felt but struggled to express. "The screaming was horrible," she said, "but it kept the monster far away. It was shouting from the mountainside, and we were down here. There was space between us. Now I think the screaming was the barrier. It was saying, 'Stay away from my territory.' We stayed away, but now it's not screaming anymore, and I think that means the territory isn't contested. I think it means the monster isn't worried about us crossing the boundary because it's already decided what the boundary is. And the boundary is closer than we ever imagined." At night, residents reported the feeling of being watched, not the vague sensation of unease that comes from living near wilderness, but the specific, undeniable awareness of eyes on you. People stopped going outside after dark. Motion sensor lights were installed. Security cameras proliferated. The cameras picked up shadows moving through yards, shapes that didn't resolve into anything identifiable. Thermal signatures that appeared at the edges of properties, standing still for long periods before moving back into the trees. The town had spent 40 years listening to a monster announce itself from a distance. Now they were learning what it felt like when the monster stopped announcing itself and started watching instead. The people of Echo Lake came to understand something that haunts them more than any scream ever did. The 40 years weren't random. They were deliberate. Every night at 10:03 p.m., the creature announced its presence from the mountains. It marked territory the way primates do, through vocalization, repetition, dominance display. But it did something else too. It taught the town to accept it, to live with it, to build their lives around the fact that something massive and intelligent occupied the forest around them. For 4 decades, it kept its distance, screamed from far enough away that no one could reach it, no matter how quickly they responded. It established control without ever making physical contact, and then it stopped. Not because it left, because it no longer needed to warn them. The residents who documented the phenomenon for years see it now. The screams were phase 1, establishing dominance from a safe distance. The silence is phase 2. The whispers, the watching, the structures appearing in the woods, the handprints pressed into mud near back porches. All of it points to the same horrifying conclusion. It's closer now. Close enough that screaming would give away its exact position. Close enough that it no longer needs to announce itself from the mountainside. The question that keeps Echo Lake awake at night isn't where it went. It's what it's waiting for. Today, the residents of Echo Lake live with a different kind of terror than the one that defined 4 decades of their history. They no longer gather in the living rooms at 10:03 p.m., bracing for the scream. They stand at their windows in the hours after dark, watching the tree line, listening to the whispers that drift from the forest, feeling the weight of something patient and intelligent, observing them from the shadows. The screams gave them something to mark time by, something to prepare for. The silence gives them nothing but questions. And late at night, when the woods are quiet and the feeling of being watched becomes unbearable, they ask themselves the same thing. Which is more terrifying, a monster that roars its presence, or one that's learned the value of silence?